Is it the end of the road for the World Health Organization International Health Regulations Amendment? Does this mean we're now being shoehorned into a new technocratic, globalized healthcare system? What's the reality here? Today, we're going to navigate the facts, the process, and we're also going to look at some of the actual misinformation that's distorting the real picture so we can get really clear on what's happening and understand the urgency of this particular deadline. And we will be back another time to talk about some even more important updates as we look at the roadmap to the overall deadlines, which we'll talk about. Because, James, it's great to have you back. Your second visit on the show here on the Pandemic Podcast. The first time around, we took a broad stroke view on the differences between the international health regulations, the pandemic treaty, as it was known at the time. So if you're interested in going back to see that, it's an important distinction to clarify what all these moving pieces are. But today we're focusing on a very important deadline, which is coming up very rapidly. Do you want to tell us, to start off with, what is this deadline and what do we need to know about it?
The December 1st deadline is 18 months past the date on and around May 27th, 2022, when a bunch of unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats, delegates to the World Health Assembly, not the World Health Organization, the World Health Assembly, where they all get together and meet, they adopted amendments to the international health regulations. Now, it's a very small batch of amendments. It's confused by many people with many other documents. And so what we're trying to do with our little interview here today is to say, look, we're talking very specifically about what is just a 5-page document, and it is amendments to 5 articles, and one of them is the important one. And the reason behind it is actually, I think, even more important. It's less about the details than it is about the process by which this is going on. But the details are actually quite simple, but yet everybody gets them confused. Currently, the way it operates is nations send their delegates to the World Health Assembly every May. So in May of 2022, that's what happened. They in a very strange fashion, agreed to change and amend the international health regulations. And the changes were in regards to the time period that each head of state has to reject any future amendments. Currently, that's 18 months. Every head of state, president, prime minister, king, pope, because even the Vatican is a part of this, they have 18 months from the date that the WHO notified them that amendments were adopted. So the amendments were adopted on May 27th, 2022. That was a Friday, end of the day. The weekend ensued, and later that month, the World Health Organization sent an official notice to all of the member nations. Hey, you've got 18 months to reject what all of the delegates just adopted. Well, here we are 17 months and two and a half weeks, into that 18-month period. And a lot of things have happened, but the one thing that hasn't happened really is any official type of discussion about, well, hold on just a moment. Why are you doing that? Well, the reason why we'll get into, but the deadline is that the people, you and I, and our representatives in Parliament or Congress or Senate or by whatever name a nation might call their legislative body, with the possible exception of Andrew Bridgen, I can't name one other member of any government who has had a discussion, said anything about, why are you shortening the time period to consider an enormous pile of amendments that may be coming in the future? And so a lot of people have been made aware of this, but unfortunately they're getting it confused with these other documents, many, many more amendments. Another document that they're trying to create that doesn't exist. It has gone by many, 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 many names. Its official document name now is another mouthful. It's the proposed negotiating text for the pandemic agreement. Okay, so now that I said that, forget it, because that's not what we're talking about. Okay, the
No.
amendments that contain hundreds of things is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about here is primarily the process by which this is done, and the fact that they're trying to shorten the time frame for the next batch. And so hopefully we can keep this to a brief, interview and focus like a laser beam on what's going on with the amendments to the international health regulations that were adopted on May 27th, 2022. And I can't reject them. You can't reject them. Your parliament or Senate or Congress or whomever, they can't reject them. We can speak up about it. But the way this is structured, the head of state, whomever that may be, by whatever name, in 196 states parties is what they call them, they can reject them just by sending a letter to the WHO and saying, well, thank you very much for these amendments, but we don't want these changes to apply to our nation. Now, if one head of state from around the world does that, it does not reject it for all of them. It's only for their country. So in my prayers and in my dreams, I'm going to wake up on December 2nd, and I'm going to say, oh, well, this nation and that nation were smart enough to reject them, and hopefully that's a longer list, than many people might hope. Maybe not. Maybe no one will say a word, but maybe some nations will look at this and go, well, wait a minute. Shortening the time to consider the rejection of and consider how we have to implement whatever might come in the future, cutting that time in half, why would we do that? That doesn't save any lives. That doesn't help anybody, doesn't bring anybody back from the dead. It doesn't address health in any way, shape, or form. No, thank you. We'll maintain our flexibility and have this longer period of time to consider what's coming next. Because, well, hold on a second. They want to shorten the period of time from 18 months down to 10. 10 months ago, absolutely nobody was paying any attention to this. Eight months ago, 10 months after they were adopted, I've been talking about this for 18 months now. And here we are, in the last stretch of about a week and a half or so over holidays here in the US. And finally, people are starting to pay attention. If the deadline had been 10 months, which is what I think they hoped, nobody would have ever had the foggiest idea that changes went through. And they want to shorten that dramatically. And the issue is really, how come they don't want to allow a conversation about it? There has been, to my knowledge, not a single discussion anywhere in any government, on any media, anywhere. And even the folks, in our movement, in the health freedom movement, are getting it all confused.
Well, James, I just want to add a bit of a wider context to this, because it would be my assumption, and maybe you're able to answer this, that changes to international regulations, whether it's the specific set of regulations or other documentation put forth by either the World Health Organization or the World Health Assembly, presumably throughout the last 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, have been through different amendment cycles and different changes. And you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I suppose from my perspective, why there's an additional concern about this now is, and I think this was true prior to the pandemic, but certainly accelerated during the pandemic, is that, I would say for the last 10 to 20 years, trust in the WHO as a international health body has diminished, particularly given the pharmaceutical conflicts of interest that have become so dominant in recent years. And then the last 3 years, where their involvement in the pandemic was as a kind of centralized technocratic governing body, has flatlined that trust. And I think the reason I make that point is presumably all of these changes would have just happened previously without such due diligence, because perhaps there was greater trust. Would that be a fair assessment?
Well, trust all around the world in every organization should be at an all-time historic low, because these organizations have been lying to us. And when we point out their lies, see, I think they've used the word and language a little bit. When we point out the missing information that they don't want everyone to know about, they call it misinformation. And so the reason to trust the government, the reason to trust your doctor, the reason to trust the WHO has been destroyed by their lies. Okay. And so you should be mistrustful. But even with that, step number one is to understand the structure and how the way it's been put together is really the problem. And so let me dive into a little bit of the history of it, because what we're really dealing with goes all the way back. I don't know if I've had this conversation with you. I've had it with a handful of people. I don't know how old you are, so we'll see how this goes. Um, can you
40 as of
remember
yesterday.
it? It did you say 40 as of yesterday? Well, bless you. That's going to
Yes.
make this joke even funnier. Um, you were not even a gleam in your parents' eyes 54 years ago, in July of 1969, when the World Health Assembly had their 22nd meeting in July of 1969. While they were meeting, I'm sure you've heard the story. Apparently 3 astronauts put on some spacesuits, got into a Saturn V rocket, went to the moon and back. While that was happening, wherever that was happening, wink, wink, right? They were meeting in Boston, Massachusetts, and that's where they created the international health regulations. So they're 54 years old. So you have no culpability in this. You were not around. There's nothing you could have said at the time. I was 9 years old. I was watching all the stuff about the moon. Nobody was paying any attention. And there's a lot of important things in that document. But what's important is what's not in that document, the international health regulations, not the amendments, but the actual 1969 document. It didn't say in there to all of the nations who signed on to it, oh, go back to your nation, go back to Congress or Senate or Parliament or your people, have a referendum, and get them to look this over and give us approval. That's not what they created. What they created was a different situation. And this is what hurts everybody's mind. They said, if nobody objects to it, it'll just go into effect. Okay. So if somebody knocked on your door and said, hey, I'll give you 18 months. And then after that period of time goes by, if you don't give me a written objection, I'm going to steal your car. I'm going to confiscate your car. It's going to be mine. Right. So, here's my address, send me a letter. And, you might go, yeah, okay. Well, if you procrastinate, you were notified. The World Health Assembly notified everybody in their quiet little way while everybody's, watching the moon. If you don't say no, this is going into effect. Okay. Now, here's where everybody just gets confused. That is not taking away your national sovereignty. What that did is it put a dividing line that destroyed your democratic representation in regards to these issues. It cut out Parliament or Congress and the people from that process. Your head of state is still considered sovereign. They can write a letter to the WHO and go, no, we don't want that. We, the people, and our representatives in Congress or Parliament lost control of that process. So what happened with that agreement was the heads of state around the world sent delegates to Boston, and they agreed amongst themselves to essentially set up a global leadership council that's in charge of the international health regulations. And when people see this, the light bulb goes off, and if you don't see it, you'll still be confused. And so by all means, give me a phone call, 310-619-3055. I'm in the US. Use any of the apps, Signal, Telegram, WhatsApp, because what I have found is it takes an explanation, because this works backwards. when they make amendments, like they did on May 27th, 2022, and they change something, if our heads of state do nothing, then the change goes into effect. If they take action and reject the change, then the status quo remains. So this is where the wires get crossed. People want to believe, and this is how it really should be, and it isn't, and this is the problem. People want to believe that in order for change to happen, we have to say, yes, okay, we're fine with that. We vote on it, and or Parliament votes on it. And yes, that is the how it should be. But this is backwards. If you do nothing, change happens. If you take action, you stop the change. And that's where everybody's wires are crossed. They want to say, Parliament is never going to approve something, that would be bad for our sovereignty. It's not about sovereignty. It's about the representative democratic process was taken away when the first international health regulations went into effect on the first day of January in 1971. Well, we get to thank our wonderful former President Richard Nixon. He was in charge at the time. I don't, off the top of my head, know who was running the government, in the UK or anywhere else at the time. In Australia, I know your audience is probably mostly the UK, and I deal mostly with the United States, but I've got a lot of new friends in Australia, and it's different there. Okay, so every nation has its own different structure. In Australia, their sovereign in their constitution is still listed as the Queen. So they have a little technical problem they've got to work out. They haven't changed that over. Perhaps King Charles will, transition and become the Queen. I don't know, but the power shifts down to the Governor General of Australia, and then into the executive branch. And in Australia, it says very clearly in their law that Parliament has zero authority, absolutely nothing, to conduct any form of agreement or treaty or amendments. It's 100% in the executive branch. And that's causing heads to burst in Australia because you go, oh, that can't possibly be. Well, I wrote an article, all the documentation is right there. You can argue about it if you want, but that's the situation. Where the language gets confused is their parliament will be told by their executive branch, we've agreed to this. Don't even think about rejecting it. You don't have the authority. Go away. The executive branch, prime minister, health minister, foreign minister, whomever, right? They make the decision to agree or not agree, and then they tell Parliament, you have to implement legislation to make sure that we're in compliance with whatever we decided. You don't get to decide. The people have no say at all. Now, there have been a lot of reforms that have been suggested, but they never went into effect because the executive branch of the government said, no, we don't want to give up any power, right? Now, in the UK, we want to talk about this, okay? And there's an office down here at the bottom, which is something that most people, why in the world would anybody know this? It's the treaty section, the legal directorate of the Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office, okay? And I'll just quote a little bit from it here. It says, the responsibility for concluding treaties involving the United Kingdom lies with the Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Affairs. Dan, you have that person on speed dial?
No, I don't. No,
Okay.
unfortunately not. I wouldn't even be able to tell you who is currently active in the FCDO.
Okay, the Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Affairs, FCDA. I can't remember it either. They do call it the FCDO, the Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Affairs Office. It's a little strange that they mix it up. Is responsible for policy aspects of all treaties. Okay, and so This remains the case even when the negotiation of the treaty is led by other government departments. So if the foreign ministry or the health ministry is doing it, it's still this office that is responsible. Now, there's an
Well,
interesting.
interestingly, David Cameron the former prime minister, has just been made Secretary of State in that department as head of that department. That's literally just happened in the last month.
Okay, the department with the main policy interest, whether it's the foreign ministry or the health ministry, in a particular treaty, has the responsibility for the preparation of an EM. The EMs must be cleared by the legal advisors of this department prior to signature by the relevant lead department ministers. Okay. Now, the interesting part of all of this, see if I can find it, is that with any kind of a treaty, the department is told that they have to lay this before Parliament for Parliament's consideration for 21 days. Well, we're down to, just slightly more than a week. And as far as I can tell, with everything, all the letters that have been sent and communications and digging into Hansard and everywhere else under the sun, it appears that someone in that office who might be responsible for presenting the changes to Parliament to give them the 21 days that they have to consider it, has either been missing in action, and maybe they just missed it, or maybe somebody made a decision and said, "Oh, we're just not going to do our job." In either case, that appears to be a failure to perform their duty. And so, if the Parliament has not had the opportunity to consider these changes, they need to do so awfully quickly. Now, being that the United Kingdom's government signed on and was one of the original supporters of these changes, it's quite likely that the government is not, they don't want them to be rejected, they want them. But that office is responsible for presenting those changes to Parliament, because unlike in Australia, the United Kingdom Parliament has the authority. They don't get to approve it or ratify it, but they are able to consider it, and if they vote to reject it, they have the authority to reject it. But those 21 sitting days where it's supposed to be laid before Parliament, to the best of my knowledge, has not happened. Now, it's not like we haven't been yelling and screaming about this. Back on April 3rd of 2023, this year, Tess Lawrie put forth a petition, official UK petition, and said, "Hey, we want to have a discussion in Parliament about this." And it went for 6 months, got 116,000 signatures, and it has been just completely ignored. They said, "Oh, we're not going to worry about it. We're not going to have a discussion." To my knowledge, they talked about a treaty back in April, and it's gone through so many changes since then that discussion is moot. It's just old news. But the issue here is 116,000 people in the United Kingdom said, "Hey, we want to have a discussion about this." And Parliament was supposed to have it presented to them for 21 days. And the typical answer is, "Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal." It's like, well, no, that's not how it's supposed to work. If Parliament looks at it, they most likely would just go along with whatever the government, had put forth, and they would not necessarily vote to reject it. But when the executive branch of government never gives them the opportunity, what we have here throughout the world is it's not really an issue with the WHO. It's an issue with, when we joined the WHO, they created a leadership council where the heads of state and their delegates go and make deals, and they don't talk to the people, and they don't say, hey, here's the deal we made. Can we get you to approve it? Well, in the UK, you don't get to approve it. You get to maybe reject it. Okay. In the United States, people talk about, oh, well, you can't do that without a 2/3 advice and consent of the Senate. Well, I got news for you, people. They did it in 1969. They did it in 2005. They did it in 2022. I haven't heard the Senate have a discussion about this. Okay. And so the lack of action on the part of members of parliament, but more importantly, arguably, the administrative malfeasance of the head of this department, which you just now informed me is Cameron, um, isn't that interesting? Now, was he in office for the entire 18 months? Apparently not. Is he in office now? Did they miss the opportunity to do their job? And, hey, I'll give you a way out. You just showed up in the office. You can blame who was ever there before you for not doing their job for 17 months, but do the job now.
Yeah, I mean, the difficult thing is with a department of that scope and size, particularly walking into what's going on in Gaza, all these other global events are going to take precedent over what would probably be deemed by their department as a simple bureaucratic exercise
So,
without recognizing the consequence.
so
And
to
I think
clear,
there's probably the legacy trust is still there from
right.
those cohorts, and it's only those of us who have paid close attention that have the concern about these amendments and what they represent. Whereas I would assume many of these individuals are just, it's like when people, click accept to the Apple terms and conditions when they get a new piece of software. It's like, sure, yeah, I can't even imagine, quite frankly, anyone in that department spending a significant amount of time reviewing the legalese within that they're presented with. I may be wrong, that maybe is a step too far. Maybe they are at least looking at the legalities, but I couldn't be certain of that because we have no evidence, nor do we know really where to turn to find out.
So, to wrap this up and try to get rid of much of the confusion, okay, the deadline on December 1st will be the moment in time where it should be crystal clear. We've had 18 months to watch this slow moving train wreck, okay? And the issue is in our own nations, we have had our democratic representation stripped away from us back in 1969. They did it in 1969. They made changes in 2005. And it did not go to the people. It did not go to Parliament or Congress or whatever. So the problem, what they're doing with a new treaty, agreement, accord, whatever they want to call it, what they're doing with this huge pile of amendments that many people are talking about that is a little bit off in the future, um, you're getting to see clearly how the procedure has cut us out of the picture. The fact that we don't have a say, and our government officials in some nations, like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, they don't get to decide. Their parliament and the people have zero control over the decisions made by bureaucrats in these ministerial offices who just they go to Geneva, they make a decision, and it changes international law, and they don't come back and tell Parliament, here's what we did, you can reject it if you want, right? If they don't do that, what do you think that is other than a failure to perform a legal duty to tell Parliament what you've done? Okay. Now, maybe they did that quietly and it's not in the record and it can't be found and we missed it because it goes back to that cross-wired problem. If Parliament just sits on their butt and does nothing, that is tacit approval for whatever was decided by somebody else. If you want to stop that decision, stop those changes, you have to do something and you have to reject them. And so, what this deadline is about is it should be making crystal clear the process and the structure of the global governance that was created in 1969. What they did was they said, we're going to have the heads of state and their delegates make these decisions. The head of state can just write a letter within 18 months and reject them. But don't ask the people. Don't say anything to Parliament. Okay. Now, I know we're pushing time, and we said we wanted to keep this short, but I want to give you the background as to why this is even happening. And it's bizarro, right? The Biden administration originally proposed a different batch of amendments on January 18th, 2022. Those got kicked to the curb because many nations around the world didn't like other aspects of what was going on in there, a lot of responsibilities that they were not ready to take on. But what happened is when that all got kicked to the curb to save face, the Biden administration and the UK and the EU and a bunch of others put forth a separate set of amendments, which is what we're talking about. And they resubmitted them in the middle of the assembly on the 24th of May. Well, there's this little rule called Amendment 55 that says if you want to put forth amendments, you have to do so 4 months in advance. So because what they had proposed got kicked to the curb, in the middle of the assembly, they put forth what we're talking about now. And what they originally wanted was to shorten the time period where the next batch of amendments would go into effect. They don't go into effect on December 1st, these changes. That's the deadline to reject them. They will go into effect on May 31st next year. So a total of 24 months from the time they were adopted. They wanted to shorten that 24 months down to 6 months. And so what Biden was trying to do was to shorten the period of implementation from 24 down to 6 months, because if you look at our election system, if you go to May of next year and go 6 months forward from there, Biden is still maybe going to be in office. And they wanted to shorten it so that it wouldn't stretch over to where our next president, whomever that may be, would be able to reject them. So this all started because Biden wanted to shorten the time frame to ram all these things through while he was still in office. And so if you think UK policy should be changed because of, our presidential election cycle, and have it be that whatever is being considered next year is going to be rammed through in a much shorter period of time. Now, just so everybody's clear, he wanted to shorten it to 6 months, but what they ended up agreeing to was if this goes through, they'll shorten it from 24 months to 12 months for things to be implemented, which means the laws would have to be written and the UK and every other nation would have to be in compliance with whatever amendments are coming down the road. And so this all started because Biden's administration wanted to shorten the time period so that they would be completely in control of the process and could ram through whatever they're hoping to ram through. And the bigger question here is, why has the media not said a word? Why has Parliament in the UK ignored 116,000 signatures on a petition to have the discussion? And in Canada, there was almost 19,000. In Australia, there was 55,000. In New Zealand, they're up past 20,000. Why is the will of the people being ignored? It's because the international health regulations are set up as a global leadership council, and they make the decisions. That is the global governance, world health government that everybody's talking about. They're trying to create. They're not trying to create it. They did it in 1969 when everybody else was looking up at the moon and Richard Nixon was in office. It's already in place. And so, Dan, thank you so much, for giving me the opportunity to focus on this. I get it. This is confusing, and I've spent a year and a half of my life because I walked into this and like, wow, this is a soap opera. Let me watch and see what the heck is going on here. I've written all about this on, you can go to my Substack, which is jamesroguski.substack.com. The hard part is spelling my name. But, give me a phone call. If you're concerned about this situation, I want everyone to be able to have clarity. Because when you have clarity on this and you don't get it all confused with everything else that's going on, you go, well, wait a minute. It's structurally flawed. When the international health regulations were allowed to be accepted and to be considered as a treaty, they talked about it in 1969. It went into effect on the first day of 1971. You weren't even alive. It's not your fault. Okay. I was like 9, 10, 11 years old. Right. At that moment in time, that is when we didn't lose our sovereignty. We lost any form of representative democratic control over this leadership council that meets once a year, a bunch of unelected, unaccountable, appointed people who, in many ways have diplomatic immunity. They can decide whatever the heck they want to decide. Yes, our head of state can reject it for our nation, but how do we, the people, influence our head of state? How are we, the people, going to get Biden to reject what he submitted? Good luck. Okay. But I call out, I did an article a month and a half ago, an open letter to world leaders. You guys could just have one of your staff write a letter. We actually wrote it. If you go to rejecttheamendments.com, I wrote the darn letter, right? And I sent it to Tedros, and I sent it to Biden, and I sent it to my representatives in Parliament. Just put a stamp on it and mail it. But I'm not the head of state. The head of state has to send a letter to the WHO saying, well, thank you very much for those amendments, but I invoke Article 61, and everybody else can have this shortened time period, but for our nation, no, thank you. We'll keep the longer period so that we can actually consider all of these changes that they're trying to ram through. So it's not the end of the world on December 1st. It's not whatever the heck it is you think you've heard. It's not that, right? It's just changing the time period for the next batch of amendments, which is troublesome. It's not the end of the world. But wait a minute. How do you guys get to do that? And we don't have any say. That is what we need to be enraged about and understand that global governance, global health leadership council is what was created in 1969 when everybody else was looking up at the moonshot. And if that awareness comes into the minds of people around the world, then my efforts for the last 18 months will have not been in vain, because that's the point, right? How come nobody's asking us? How come nobody's asking Parliament? How come nobody in the media is talking about it? Okay. And so, thank you for the opportunity to talk to your audience about this right now.
Oh, James, thank you. I mean, it's become incredibly clear for me, and this is the way you've described it has provided a deeper level of clarity, even still, for me. And unfortunately, what it's revealed is a deeper set of problems, because this issue is not just limited to a single set of health amendments.
Yes.
In the increasingly globalized world, the global governance structure practically mirrors this approach, the opt-out approach. And interesting enough, in the UK, not that long ago, we instigated the GDPR regulations, which was purely around data protection. But what it meant was that you had to now opt in. Previously, it was the similar sort of opt-out system, and people would just constantly get caught out because the exact reasons we've outlined. People miss the deadline, or they don't read the terms and conditions. They just tick the box, or they don't even have to tick a box. It's just that they're opted in the exact way you outlined with the car example. GDPR changed that, so now they have to opt in first. Whereas now, what we've got here is an opt-out scenario. But not only do we have an opt-out scenario, there is no democratic process. The process you've outlined is where there is a deep flaw. And that is not limited to this particular set of circumstances, which is the deeper concern for me. Now, I want to keep it tight to finish this. The piece that's not so clear for me now
Mhm.
is that though the head of state in the United Kingdom has to be the one that rejects the amendment, I would make an assumption, and this is where I'd like you to clarify, that that decision is somewhat delegated to this office that you've outlined, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, or Foreign Commonwealth and Affairs Office, whatever it's called now,
Mhm.
and that someone within that department has the responsibility. So there is surely someone that set of amendments has been addressed to assess and then provide their response to give the official response from the United Kingdom government or the head of state. Do we know who that individual is specifically? Do you know? How do we find out? And even if we did find out or know, how would we go about influencing that individual? Because you could, I think, and already I'm answering the question myself. I'd imagine there is a multi-pronged approach. It would be important to obviously engage your MP because they should have the ability to influence policy. We should be able to engage directly with the department and the decision makers. And of course, if we were to go 360, you would expect to use the media, etc. But to answer the first question, in each nation, do we have clarity around who exactly is who has the delegated responsibility for dealing with these matters? Do we know, or do you know? Do we have
the the the
any
easy
idea?
the easy answer, okay, is who is any nation's head of state? Okay, obviously in the United States, President Biden. In the UK, King Charles, and how that flows down through the executive branch. You have prime minister, health ministers. It's the treaty section legal directorate of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. It's a mouthful. Okay, not somebody that you normally see on mainstream media TV telling you about the next treaty. All right, and so one of the games that gets played between the WHO and everyone around the world is, oh, not my job. You got to go talk to them. And then they say, oh, it's not my job. Oh, you got to go talk to them. Um, the point really is the people have put forth an official petition asking for a discussion. This document about this office's duties says that treaties are supposed to be laid before Parliament for 21 days. Ask your member of Parliament, did that happen? Did we miss it? Did you
Yes,
miss it?
that's a clear
Did,
action.
did you get a chance to? All we've been saying is, can we talk about this? Can we have a discussion? And and I don't know the answer to this, and either way, it's not good. Either the office holder who is responsible for presenting it either chose not to and said, oh, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. You don't need to talk about it. Or they just failed to do their duty. Now, whether it's, nefarious or, a mistake, regardless, um, it seems like that discussion has not been allowed to happen. Now, it's supposed to be 21 days. All right. Well, you missed that wider opportunity, so you failed to do your job. You still got a week or so. Um, could you please respond to our request for a discussion about this? Now, I'm not I'm a very optimistic person, but I'm not naive. Um, Everyone in Parliament would just sit there and do nothing and look at it for the remainder of this period of time because they have to proactively vote to reject it. Okay. Well, boy, that sure would be very similar to a lack of confidence. It's like, oh, you guys made this decision and you're just showing it to us at the last minute. And suddenly members of parliament grew a spine and said no. Boy, that would be amazing. Okay. But what we, the people, get to watch is this slow moving train wreck of they're not doing their job. Big surprise. Okay. That is the problem. They're not
But it also
listening.
illustrates that at the last hour, it also illustrates the need for this extended time frame because let's suppose anything gets to this last stage, and quite frankly, I'm sure MPs and other ministers have many things on their plate, and the MPs are supposed to be looking after their local area and now getting involved in global governance. So I understand the complexity,
Mhm.
or can imagine, the complexities. but that therefore shows that if we've already missed the 21-day deadline, imagine, if that's happening across every amendment, there's just insufficient due diligence time here. I think the bigger problem is people don't have the same skepticism that we do over the trustworthiness of the WHO and the WHA. That's a much bigger conversation and a bigger issue. I suppose what I'm trying to hone into now to conclude is there any mileage? What action can be taken now? I mean, straight away, I'm going to email my own MP, and for our audience at home, I'm going to put together a template so that we can all do this, because it's not too late to get the voice heard in terms of making sure that this piece is taken care of. And this 21-day deadline, James, is that a parliamentary regulation? All treaties must be subjected to that? Is that a legal process or a regulatory process that has failed, or is it a optional process?
In this document that lays it all out under laying before Parliament and publication, okay, it says, I'll just read it. I know it's a little bit boring. Under Part 2 of the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act of 2010, CRAG, no treaty that is subject to ratification, acceptance, approval, or the mutual notification of the completion of procedures. A treaty is just notes between governments as well in the definitions, or to which the United Kingdom intends to accede. So the government clearly submitted this. They intend to go by it. None of that can be brought into force unless it has been laid before Parliament for 21 sitting days. Well, have they laid it before Parliament for 21 sitting days? The issue is understanding that still gives the people in the UK a little tiny bit of democratic representation. And if the executive branch of government has failed in their obligation to give Parliament that 21 days to review, and that government and the petition committee have ignored, going all the way back to April 3rd, the call of 116,000 UK citizens in an official petition to have that discussion, right? When your government refuses to discuss something, what do you do?
Yeah. I mean, this is a wider conversation of the fundamental breakdown of the democratic process. But what's important, James, you've outlined, which I think is the fundamental here. It's understanding the process, the democratic process, and the fundamentals around that. Because what's tended to happen is because of all the panic around it all, there's lots of mails going into the MPs, and it's distorting this core issue, because ultimately there are plenty of things people will disagree on what should be approved, not be approved. What's critical is we maintain the democratic representation. Without that component, and it's been absent for a long time from the way you've outlined it, and as I've hypothesized, it's likely to be problematic across every one of these globalized, centralized bodies where treaties are passed. But in this particular with this particular matter, we've got a very short period of time to ensure that democratic representation is upheld. We've got both the petition that has not been debated, and we've also got this 21-day period, which is a grey area because we don't know. So I think what's key is we discover that whether this 21-day period has been honoured. If it has, then, well, we have to look at the notes at what happened in the discussion to see how things proceeded. But I certainly have seen nothing. And I know people have been looking in the Hansard and other documents to look for evidence of such a discussion. And I don't believe that that's happened. So the window is shrinking, but we're going to take some action. I'm certainly going to be writing to my MP. We'll put together some notes, and I'll come back to you, James, after the call for some guidance on this. But we will take action, and it's important that we do. En masse. So what I'll ask our audience at home is first thing I'm going to ask you to join. If you haven't done so already, please join our mailing list at danastingregory.com/pandemic, where we'll send out our template. And James, you've got some amazing resources there. I think it's really important that people also subscribe to. what are the primary resources they should go to that you've put together for this particular matter?
If you go to rejecttheamendments.com, it has all of that information from a United States perspective, okay? But all the details are there. I wrote a letter that I sent to members of Congress. I wrote a letter that I sent to the President Biden. I wrote a letter that I sent to Tedros. I rejected these. I'm like, no, I don't think that's a good idea. But they're not going to listen to my letter, obviously. There are people that I'm working with, and after we do this video, I'll obviously publish this video, and there'll be additional information working with people around the world who are doing the same thing. But it's essentially very simple. You're supposed to have a discussion about this, and whatever the decision is made from that, that's the democratic process. How come it didn't happen? Why are you trying to just not do your job and have such an open discussion so that you can ram through whatever it is you're talking about now in the future? That's not acceptable.
Absolutely. And to me, that's the core message. And that's the important takeaway from this session. There's a lot more that we could unpack and discuss here. As you've touched upon, it's not the end of the road, and it's not the end of the world.
Right.
It's shrunk the period of time for consideration, which is problematic. Irrespective of what eventually happens, we now then need to turn our attention to the wider amendments that will follow and the pandemic treaty, accord, whatever it's called now. And we're going to have James back to discuss those wider components. But for now, given the time, which is why we brought James in for today, for this conversation, is we have a very short window to try and influence this outcome. And it's important that we stay focused on that particular matter. Any closing words from you, James, before we wrap up from today's discussion?
I'm an optimistic person, and I envision myself awakening on December 2nd. And maybe there will be news between now and then. And maybe there will be a list of nations where their head of state awakened and wrote a letter and said no. And there will then be a fracture in the IHR where some nations have said, no, we would prefer to have the longer period of time to consider what's going on. So we take action to reject Biden's attempt to tighten up the time period. And they will be viewed in a very small way as good leaders, as brave souls, as governments who considered the situation and took action. All of the nations whose heads of state fail to take action before December 1st, in my world, they're going to look really stupid and weak. They can't even stand up to the WHO about a little tiny bit of paperwork shortening the time period. They're allowing this pressure, which essentially is coming from the United States and Biden and quite frankly, the UK and the European Union. No. We want every nation on the planet to shove these changes through next May. And so I wonder how many world leaders have the spine and the courage to stand up to the WHO on this little teeny thing. This is a little teeny thing. If they can't stand up to the WHO and say, no, it's been this way since 2005, let's just keep it that way, that's fine, right? If they, by their inaction, their procrastination, and quite frankly, their cowardice, they go, no, we're just going to do nothing, and the change will go through. We're not going to push back against the WHO, even on this. That is a pathetic leader. It's not a leader at all. It's somebody who everyone who's watching this should watch their head of state and see if they cannot even muster the courage to write a letter to the WHO saying, you know what, no, we're good. Let's just keep things the way they are. We get to watch a slow-moving train wreck of the cowardice of all of the heads of state in 196 nations around the world. And, you got a front row seat. We'll see what happens.
Thank you, James. Yeah, thank you for the clarity provided in today's conversation. Now, to our listeners at home, please do look out for the action steps that we'll share with you and do share this episode. We need to help as many people understand this concept. It's really important. We're looking at a subset of a major set of issues here, and this is the piece that we can influence right now. So please take action, share this video, and make sure that you write to your represented elected officials, and together we can actually make an impact. And I share your optimistic approach. Thank you for that, James. My hope is that at least one nation will rebut these amendments, and that could create a ripple effect or a problem.
Even
for the
when
overall
our government
process.
representatives failed to do their job, we, the people, have to stand up and do ours. And if you go to sleep at night knowing that you did the best you could, you can live with yourself. Okay? If you don't take action, you only have that person in the mirror to blame.